Hello and welcome to another Healthy Bite. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Now, before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, this week we explored with Robin Hill's emotional intelligence, and people are familiar, of course, with IQ, and now we are talking this week about EQ. And I thought I'd also touch on in this Healthy Bite something called HQ. But let me start with IQ, because it's something we hear a lot about. And there's one definition which is extremely popular, and it is the aggregate or global capacity of an individual to act purposefully, to think rationally, and to deal effectively with his or her environment. And when we look at IQ scores, the average IQ score is about 100. 95% of us lie between 70 and 130. And that would mean that there are a few individuals over 130 and there are a few individuals below 70. But 130 is definitely would be considered gifted. And, one only has to think of the IQ of Albert Einstein, it's between 160 and 180, which definitely puts him in the genius category. But actually, when you look at what else has gone on in the world, here are the highest IQs. Marilyn Vost Savant, an IQ of 228. Christopher Hirata, 225. Kim Ung-yong, 210. Down there is Edith Stern, 200, and Garry Kasparov, the chess player, 194. So IQ is quite a range, but that's IQ. What about EQ? EQ is more about intuition, empathy, creativity, awareness, and it's different. I mean, IQ relates more to logic, to memory, to language, to concentration and comprehension. But EQ is something more about design and creativity. It's a more holistic, if you like, expression of an individual. And Daniel Goldman, who Robin does refer to and is considered the godfather of EQ, it's the ability to understand and manage your own emotions and those of people around you. And boy, if ever we needed a time when people were exercising and improving their EQ, I think the last few years, as we've become increasingly more polarized, have certainly challenged our EQ. 80 to 90% of the competencies that differentiate top performers are in the domain of emotional intelligence. So leaders are really looking in organizations towards people who have a high emotional intelligence, an ability to self-reflect, to show empathy, to self-soothe, important, self-regulation, very important. 5 characteristics of emotionally intelligent people: they're change agents, aren't afraid of change or taking risks. And we've spoken quite a lot about what constitutes people being open to change. And one of those things is your locus of control, meaning do you see yourself as a victim of the world, in which you would see the locus of control in your life as being external to yourself? Or is your locus of control internal? Do you see that you actually do have a good deal of control over your life? And obviously we don't have complete control over our lives, but how that proportion plays out in your life determines whether you are open to change, whether you're a change management. I think if you have an internal locus of control, you probably have a higher level of emotional intelligence. Another aspect of being open to change is a tolerance of ambiguity. We love black and white. We love right and wrong, good and evil. And you can see that playing out in the current pandemic and the way it's being managed, that people want simple solutions, want answers to problems. They want definite plans moving forward. And I think that's admirable. I think it's important, but I think it's a little more nuanced than that. And so do you have a high tolerance of ambiguity or a low tolerance? So if you have a high tolerance of ambiguity, that suggests that perhaps your emotional intelligence is higher and you are more open to change. Self-awareness is another thing. They don't let weaknesses hold them back. They know what they are feeling. Being empathetic and being able to relate to others, having a more balanced view, knowing how to maintain a balance and practice in self-care, and also being gracious. The glass half full mentality. They feel good about their lives. So this is what constitutes characteristics of people with emotional intelligence. And you can be ticking off those boxes and thinking, yeah, that's me. I think I do. Or, oh my goodness, no, I don't really fit that bill. So emotional intelligence is actually a really important aspect of living in a community. And when you have a high level, there are different ways, and Robin talks about measuring this. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you might want to pause this and see the list of low emotional intelligence against high emotional intelligence. For example, having low emotional intelligence, you're aggressive, demanding, egotistical, bossy, confrontational, as opposed to being assertive, ambitious, driving, strong-willed and decisive. Another aspect of low emotional intelligence is you're easily distracted. You're glib, you're selfish, you're a poor listener, you're impulsive. And the flip side of that for those with a high emotional intelligence would be you're warm, you're enthusiastic, you're sociable, charming and persuasive. Other aspects, I think this is quite interesting because you could be ticking these mental boxes off as we go. Another aspect of low emotional intelligence is to say you are resistant to change, you're passive, you're unresponsive, you're slow and you're stubborn, as opposed to having a high emotional intelligence in this area where you are patient and stable, predictable, consistent, and you're a good listener. I hope you are a good listener. If you're listening to this, I'm assuming you have a high emotional intelligence, but I move on. And finally, another aspect that is that shows us characteristics of people with low emotional intelligence are that they're critical, they're picky, they're fussy, they're hard to please, they're perfectionists. Gee, as a dentist, that's a bit of you do need that skill as a dentist to be a perfectionist. But anyway, the flip side of that is that you're detailed, you're careful, meticulous, systematic, and you're neat. No, that fits far better into the dental profession, and you really do need a high level of emotional intelligence to be a good dentist. There's no question about that. But Robin talks about different ways of measuring it, and the Myers-Briggs is one that I think is an interesting one. You can do it online, and you can really think about the different personality types. And they talk about 4 areas by which you can judge, and they may have been covered in that last list, but here I'll just cover it with you. Are you an introvert or an extrovert? Do you, as an extrovert, are you energized by people and enjoy a variety of tasks, a quick pace and are good at multitasking? Or are you an introvert, often like working alone or in small groups, prefer a small, deliberate pace and like to focus on one task at a time? Now, this is a continuum, because when I think of myself, I have often said, to my wife's own surprise, that I do consider myself an introvert, and I do enjoy working on projects on my own. But I do enjoy people, and I do get energized by people. So it's not all black and white, but it's an interesting way of questioning yourself and what kind of a person you are. Another measure is, are you a sensors or are you intuitives? Now, sensors are realistic people who like to focus on the facts and details. They apply common sense and past experience to find practical solutions to problems. Intuitive people tend to prefer to focus on possibilities and the big picture. easily see patterns and value innovation, and seek creative solutions to problems. Now, I see a little bit of each of those in myself, but one would draw a continuum of a line where you are totally sensor or totally intuitive, or you're a total extrovert or you're a total introvert. I don't think any of us are really one completely or the other, but we are mixes of each. Other measure is, are you a thinker or a feeler? Thinkers tend to make their decisions using logical analysis, objectively weighing pros and cons, and value honesty, consistency, and fairness. Interesting. Feelers tend to be sensitive and cooperative and decide based on their own personal values and how others will be affected by their actions. Again, I think there's a combination of both. So, and the final measure is, are you a judger or a perceiver? Judges tend to be organised and prepared, like to make and stick to plans, and are comfortable following most rules. Perceivers prefer to keep their options open, like to be able to act spontaneously, and like to be flexible with making plans. So this is very much, are you an ESTJ or an INFP? Are you an extrovert, a sensor, a thinker, or a judger? Or are you an introvert, an intuitive person, a feeler, and a perceiver? And of course, you can be combinations of any one of those. In fact, there are, according to the Myers-Briggs, at least 16 different personality types, and I'm not going to go into them with you here. But again, if you're watching this on YouTube, and I suggest you could, pause the screen and have a read of them. I think it's most interesting and certainly an intriguing thing. Now, while there are 16 characteristics or personality types, and people love categorizing people and things, and I suspect it's something more like 7.5 billion character types. So IQ, well, there's Albert Einstein leading the way. EQ is how we relate to others, how we think and how we feel. And there's another quotient that I wanted to introduce you to, or be encouraged for you to think about, and that is HQ. And what is HQ? Well, HQ is your health quotient. That would be a combination of your overall health and your awareness of health issues. There is so much in health that we know. And there is so much in health, there's quite a lot in health, that we know we don't know. But having been in health for 42 years, and I was just reflecting on this today in my surgery with one of my partners, Dr. Ron Ehrlich, I was saying the thing I find most exciting and stimulating about health, and this is after at least 42 years, well, 45 if I consider or even more if I consider my university. Yes, I would. I'd have to say it was 47 years when I consider my university years. And even after 47 years of focusing on health as a profession, I still find it stimulating and exciting. And why? Because in health, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. And that is exciting to me, but threatening to some. Some people love certainty. Some people see right and wrong, good and bad. They're resistant to change. They have a low tolerance of ambiguity. But when it comes to an awareness of health issues, I know there is a great deal I don't know. And what I've been learning, particularly in these last 2 years, in particular these last 2 years, is I've discovered so much more that I don't know, I even didn't know. And so that's exciting, that's stimulating. I think the key to exploring health is, rather than looking at right and wrong answers, is to take a more holistic view of it and see how the particular gem that is being shared with you at this particular moment, and it's this particular moment and other moments that you will be listening to others, there's so much information out there. Rather than looking for the right and wrong, keep an open mind and see how that fits in to a more holistic view. And remembering the holistic health model that we focus on in our practice, that I've focused on in my book, and is basically the blueprint for this podcast, and that is to see our lives as a balancing beam where we define stress. Well, firstly, let me say we define stress as anything that compromises our immune system and promotes chronic inflammation. And so we try to identify and minimize as many of those as we can. And to that effect, I work on a 5 stressor model: emotional, environmental, postural, nutritional, and dental stress. So identify and minimize as many of those stressors that have the ability to compromise your immune system and promote chronic inflammation, the common denominator in all diseases, mental and physical. And on the other hand, to build resilience by focusing on the 5 pillars of health: sleep, breathe, nourish, move, and think. And understand that this whole balancing beam pivots on your genes and how your genes express themselves, epigenetics. If you keep that as an overriding model, I think approaching health becomes extremely exciting, because rather than looking for the one answer to the problem, you start to build knowledge, and with knowledge comes power. And ultimately, one of the things that I'm also very keen on promoting in this podcast is that while the world around us becomes increasingly more complicated and complex, I believe the solutions are remarkably simple. And we do need to go back to those simple solutions that are cheap, accessible, and effective in terms of improving our health. So a health quotient, our HQ, is about our overall health and an awareness of health issues. And if you're a regular listener of this podcast, then you will know just what I'm talking about. And we're just building our knowledge week by week. And I thought this week's focus on EQ was a particularly interesting one, because over the last 2 years, during this lockdown, I've been looking far more closely at a new way of looking at stress, which is called the Polyvagal Theory. And the Polyvagal Theory is all about how we regulate and co-regulate as a species. And I'm going to be doing more podcasts about that. But the point being that I am just very much focused on learning, keeping my mind open and looking at HQ and my EQ, and trying to hope that my IQ will help me along the way. I'd have a look at this week's podcast. Ultimately, what we're looking at is another quotient which I think we could all strive for, and that is the Happiness Quotient, which is all about getting our social, environmental, spiritual, physical, emotional, intellectual, and occupational lives in a good balance. I hope this helps. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich.
This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.